So what I'm going to do first is 10 minutes, set the context, and pick out 5 of those areas that we're going to use as our starting point. Now, what I'd like to do is suggest. It's up to you to say, how does that feel? Do these feel like the right shifts? They're different to the shifts that Chun Hong has been talking about. There are some similarities there. There are some things that you might think, maybe not quite. Let's talk about that instead. So all the way through the day, we'd like to think there is space for flexibility for you to push back to tell us how you want to work through these things too. So that's almost the ground rules in the spirit of the day. And just two responses to Eva's really interesting presentation in particular. We a couple of years ago did some work in the vocational education sector in the UK, further education. Colleges that people might go to get vocational qualifications rather than go to university perhaps. One of the principals of the colleges that we interviewed told us that for her, and this college was in a bit of London, which trains up lots of people to go and work in the media industry in particular. For her, the big issue was not the quality of teaching and the qualifications that people got, but their ability to equip people with the skills to be able to survive in a career that will not be a job for life and will in fact be nothing like a job for life. So constantly, every 3 to 4 months, you will have to be sitting down, telling your story, interviewing, networking, using all of those soft skills that are, the saying goes, are the hardest to develop. And I think that's absolutely at the core of what we need to work through today, not only for individuals entering the labour market, but for public servants who are an established part of the delivery mechanisms for public services, for whom the context is changing, as Chun Hong said, very, very quickly. So that's the perspective we hope to bring. And Collaborate, our organisation, as Max says, is relatively new. We were set up at the end of 2012. We were set up to be an organisation that would sit in between the sectors and help to build readiness for the kind of changes that we've just been talking about, to improve relationships between the public, the private and the social sectors in public service delivery, but also to look at, in theory and in practice, what a new model of public services might look like that tries very actively to get beyond those perspectives that Max outlined of, the public choice or the new public management version of the world, which I think doesn't quite reflect what we know about human capacity, capability, and the way that we potentially can collaborate. So that's what we do, and we do most of our work in the UK, some of our work internationally, and we're really, really delighted to be not only here in part of this discussion, but then able to absorb what comes out of it and reflect some of that back onto the UK, which I think considers itself to be a leader in lots of senses in terms of public service reform, but the implications of being a leader in some of the areas that it is are perhaps not so positive over the long term. So that's, be really interesting for us to reflect on that. We have a set of operating principles ourselves for the work that we do. This is what we use to accept or turn down work. Now, we accept more than we turn down, right? That's what you do. But this is almost a set of ground rules for the discussion. So outcomes and values, not sectors. If we really care about public services that are reshaped around the public and the way that our relationships, our values, the way that we work plays out, then we absolutely have to get beyond a version of public services that is about silos and delivery. We support collaborative citizens. So what does that mean? Well, that's a different starting point, isn't it? Public services are not therefore about delivery, but about working with people to do things with them, to enable them to achieve their own aspirations, rather than delivering public goods in a very traditional way. We work with people who want genuine collaboration. Well, maybe this is Chun Hong's point about the way that generations in public service currently will change the shape of that public service. This is about actually people grasping an opportunity. Some people, if you like, the world changes quickly, and there is a phrase in the social innovation world which is full of phrases that don't mean anything. But this phrase is called innovating for the edge case. Now, I'm not sure whether this is true, but what that means is that you push. You innovate for, if you like, the very edgy, the furthest on. And in doing so, what you do is reflect back things that the rest of the world, perhaps the people that aren't moving so quickly, can use, adapt, absorb, do something with. Now, it may be the case that Singapore is that edge case. So in thinking about your your capabilities, but also the gaps and the distance you feel you have to travel. We can reflect some of that back on elsewhere. Honesty, trust. We've already talked about those issues. Absolutely key. You don't get to share risk. You don't get to do things together without caring about trust and how you build it. And the missing piece for us in a lot of the work that we do, whether in the UK or internationally, is that lack of application to doing what one of my Spanish colleagues called the dark work that builds that trust. So what do you do before you get in the room? You know, we can have a great discussion today, but what holds our feet to the fire afterwards to make sure that we're taking some of what we discussed and playing that back into our everyday jobs? And then the last point is about readiness and capacity, if you like. This is not only about what we do, but about how we build capacity for the next generation to be able to not only do things differently, but think through their own different versions of what's possible, what's outside the box. So, 15 minutes has turned to 10. What we're going to do is very quickly look at a question. What is a public service? What do we think of as a public service? Why is that important? How might public services be changing? And in fact, I think we can go quickly through some of that because Chun Hong's given such a great narrative around those shifts in the changing context. And then I think let's reflect that back on people working in today's public service, and then over to you to workshop through some of that. And as I say, this is a set of suggestions and themes. And I think, you know, please do take it in that spirit. Get ready to resist, if you like. Okay. So what is a public service? There's a question that has no answer. There's no single answer to that. This data that you see up there comes from a piece of in-depth survey work that Collaborate did last year across the UK, which, you know, even a small island like the UK has its own issues with governance and very different views about what a public service should be across the island. But what you get from this is that the two most popular answers, if you like, the strongest push was towards a public service being a service for the whole community that's accessible to everybody. And the idea of something that is almost, it's the utility point, isn't it? Rather than how it's defined, i.e. it's via centrally collected taxes and delivered by government. Actually, that stuff is by the by. We actually care about the fact that a public service is something that is useful to us and that is available to everybody. Now, just reflect on that a second. What is useful for us and available to everybody? What should be available to everybody now? If you're a young person, to take Eva's point, just entering the labour market in Egypt or in England or in France, what's a service that should be available to you and that is useful, that allows you to achieve your goals? Maybe it isn't a traditional version of what a social work service might be or an employment service might be. It's probably a smartphone, a fast broadband connection, and access to a group of people who are already in work. It's a network, it's technology. It's a very different form of infrastructure. It's a very different way of looking at a public service. That's just one example, but I think if you take that starting point, the possibilities then open up. And I think in terms of Max's question about the role and the shape of the state and what the state should do, that gets you to some very different possibilities down the line. So that's something to hold. Let's hold on to that and keep thinking about, well, what is a public service? What should be a public service? Public service values, public service ethos. If you ask public servants what is a public service, lots of them will say it's about the values and the ethos. The reason why I work for government and not in the private sector. Sometimes the answer is because we feel the government has the right values. Sometimes there is something called a public service ethos that will play out strongly in terms of the way government and public services communicate what they do. But is that and should that be unique to services designed and provided by government, which is very traditionally what we consider public services to be? Well, we prefer to use the term services to the public because it signifies a broader, I think, picture of services that the public rely on. So if you like, the mobile phone networks and the supermarkets become just as much a part of the shared value set as government services do from that point of view. When we asked people in that same survey what they, we asked them a question about the extent to which they disagreed with a question about treatment and outcomes, if you like. So we said to people, do you think being treated with dignity and respect is more or less important than what's being delivered by public services? And we asked the question the other way around too, essentially trying to get a sense of what people care about, but also what people value. Now, a big majority, as you can see, of people said being treated with dignity and respect is just as important as the outcome being delivered. Now, that is not something that is exclusive to the public sector and public services. If you're a private business that is involved in any kind of customer services, you go out of business pretty quickly if you don't live up to some of those expectations. So the question is, again, to keep in our mind, as public services change, as they become more diverse, as services are delivered by a whole range of public, private, social organisations and in very different ways, is there something which holds that together that's not the traditional public service ethos, but is about a set of values that can be shared across the sectors? Now, those values change as the context changes. Chun Hong has already given us a really good skip through that. Some of these issues are obvious to people. There's lots of graphs. Most of these graphs go in the wrong direction, don't they? They start small and they go big, and the big thing's always terrible. But there's some of those issues are obvious to everybody, and different countries are working through them in different ways. Population change, of course, causes huge issues around an aging workforce and how that, if you like, reshapes the labour market by accident. And of course, issues like pension reform are a huge deal too. But the other end of the scale, in a country like India, there is and many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, the opposite problem exists. It's about economic inclusion for a young population that's growing quite fast. So these are things that are reshaping the role of the state in different ways in different places. Common to all of them is this, the graph you'll see on the top right, which is very difficult to see, but that comes from World Bank data, which is about the determinants of conflict in society. Now, most people put that down to inequality of different types, inequality of access to resources, inequality of income. You know, that's not rocket science, it's an obvious point. But actually, how are we reshaping public services to impact on some of those things? Well, they're big structural issues. The data on the bottom left is human development indicators. They tell you that you know, we're having a conversation about public services that has some commonalities to it, but the top right of the graph is Norway and the bottom left of the graph is Burundi. It's always the same. You know, how do we start to speak to both ends of that spectrum? Well, some of those things are leapfrog issues, aren't they? Technology, ethos, entrepreneurialism, they are not exclusive to mature welfare states who have the resources to be able to think and apply these issues. They are things that can be grasped and used across the board. So we, in line with lots of people, I think in line with the centre here, think that there is a rationale to be rethinking the art of doing public services. Partly in response to this context, but partly also in response to what we know. Eva mentioned the rise of data, and you know, that's not just big data, but that is being able to understand the impact of what we do in the context in which we work from very different perspectives. I think that changes the way we look at that context. So if you look at the World Bank's World Development Report from this year, it talks about behavioral science. It talks about behavior and decision making. It says in the executive summary, maybe we've been a bit simplistic. Maybe this version of how you design and deliver and apply things isn't quite how people live. Well, shock horror, most of us would probably have been able to tell them that a long time ago. But that's a changing perspective, isn't it? You can see we edge towards it, but that perspective on how change works and how behavioral change works is moving. Systems, place, resilience. It's no accident that UNDP are using that language of resilience, because it's not just about service delivery, it's about place and about people and how you reinforce the system around service delivery. And I think, again, you know, the same can be said about markets and how we see the public service market. These are times that are becoming increasingly complex, increasingly diverse, as Chun Hong has said. So the question is not only about public service excellence, it's about, if you like, the excellence and the capability of the system and the networks around public service. And again, that's something that it'd be very interesting to get your reflection on. So 5 shifts, 5 more shifts, you've got 10 shifts. But maybe we can start the workshop with these 5. What we've tried to do here in partnership with Max and colleagues is to pick out some directions of travel. Now, with anything like this, what we're doing is characterizing. We're saying, this is how the world looks and feels now, this is where we might be heading. Of course, we have different starting points, but let's have a think about these for a minute and go from top to bottom. From government as service delivery to government as a platform. What does that mean? Well, in lots of cases, government is and public services are about public service delivery, about shoring it up, about delivery of public goods in parts of the world where the delivery of public goods is a matter of life or death. We're not underplaying that, but what we are saying is there is a shift going on, both in terms of the way that data is being used. So the open data community is a very good example of that, about how government is opening up its own processes to enable other people to take what is data, knowledge, insight, resources, and develop services and ways of working for themselves. But government is also a platform in that it is commissioning out more and more services to different agencies, whether NGOs or whether private sector organisations, or in the UK context, a combination of the two. So complex delivery chains, government building a platform for contracting, subcontracting and co-production down the scale is a very, very strong part of where public services are going. Now, we don't know the implications of that yet, but it absolutely feels like a direction of travel. What do you need? What kind of capabilities do you need? That really does change the way you think about what a public servant does. It's no longer about delivering an upwards accountability in a traditional way. It's about managing a market. It's about, if you like Obama's phrase, leading from behind. So how you can affect change in collaboration with others and not only in doing things yourself. Big shifts, big behavioral cultural shifts, as well as, if you like, shifts in practice. Secondly, from public service workers as bureaucrats to public entrepreneurs, I think we've covered some of this territory, but they are different skill sets. When we think about work as an entrepreneur and work as a bureaucrat, they feel like very different things, at least. Now bureaucracy becomes a pejorative word, which I think is wrong. We need to celebrate good bureaucracy, and absolutely that's in the tradition of great public services. But this skill of leveraging new resources, of looking outwards and discovering different ways of working, of pulling in influences and if you like, mechanisms and tools from across sectors and across cultures is absolutely going to be vital. So it's just as important for us to make sure that we are learning from the way that the arts and the dance sector in the UK collaborates as it is to look at what government is currently doing. To Eva's point, there's a whole world out there that I think is influential, and we now have the tools to learn and adapt in a way that is perhaps easier than before. Third shift is around risk. And risk and trust are really the same, two sides of the same coin. What we are seeing in a lot of the work we're doing in the UK is that what stops change from happening to the benefit of the public, and some of that change is very collaborative. So, for example, what stops different bits of different silos of the public sector, social work, health, education, for example, from working together is that they have different risk models, and the risk of not delivering against one of those models undermines their ability to work together for the collective whole. So actually, can we start to think about risk as collective? Can we start to shift the way that public services typically look at risk, which is about the risk of not delivering, to look at the risk of not collaborating? And what would that actually mean in terms of our accountability frameworks? The fourth point is about a way of working, a way of thinking and working, from fixed and controlled to adaptive and messy. And if anybody reads their Harvard Business Review, the leading business thinkers are always talking about messy leadership and adaptive leadership, and there is a lot of that language now in some of the creative thinking about public service reform. Some of that comes out of Harvard, some of that comes from Australia, some of that comes from Asia, some of that comes from sub-Saharan Africa. But that idea of working with complexity, working with the politics rather than denying that political influence exists, and thinking about leadership as something that is about questions, phrasing the right question and not coming up with the answers, I think is a really, really core part of shifting towards this model of collaborative public services that we're all talking about. Now, How do you do that? What are the tools to do that? To a certain extent, that is a mindset, but actually the ability to engage with the public, to deliberate, to use technology, to be able to, if you like, be open to different influences and make decisions that are transparent and open and that have a rationale that people can see is a really important part of that. And then finally, it's this question, back to this question about ethos and values. Is there a shift? It's a question to you. If we're moving to a model of public services in some parts of the world that is less about what was and more about what will be, then what's going to hold that together? What holds the businesses, the NGOs and government together against a set of values? Is that even possible? It doesn't feel like a public service ethos anymore, because actually when young people are surveyed about what they want to do with their lives, lots of them say they want to achieve things for everybody and they want to do public good. But less and less and less of them say that has to be via the traditional means. More and more people are starting social businesses. Social enterprises are bigger and bigger things across the world. So what does that mean? It's less a fixed ethos and more a set of values. And I think that's what we'd like to put out there for debate. How does that feel to you in the parts of the world in which you work? Okay. I'm going to whip through this. You're going to give us some examples. So actually these are just snapshots. But what you can see on this map are initiatives from Twawiza and open data related work in East Africa, through to things like Bolsa Familia and Oportunidades in Latin America, Mexico and Brazil, which experiment with conditionality and personalization in welfare, all about sharing risk and trust. Harlem Children's Zone in New York, in Harlem, which is about creating a collaborative model that goes beyond the institution of school to improve education through cultural collaboration too. Initiatives like care credits in Japan, a fantastically entrepreneurial way of linking care for older people with childcare. Let's think, if we have an aging problem, but we also have a young population and people that need to be back in work, then why do we address these things through separate service silos? There are ideas out there, ways of blending these things together. And then the social impact bonds piece of paper, I'm not really sure what that is. It's a piece of paper that you can see at the top of the diagram there, represents a set of emerging thinking and practice around social finance and social impact. And that will be more familiar to some than others. But the guiding principle behind that is that you are addressing often very messy, very complex problems through leveraging different types of resource. So that is often the public sector, the social sector and the private sector combining to start to build an investment model around intervening early in a very non-traditional way around issues that traditional public services have often failed to solve. We can get into some of those examples through the day and hear from you, but there's just a snapshot. And just to illustrate that, this stuff is happening everywhere. The innovation in public services is not exclusive to the parts of the world that would have seen themselves as mature welfare states and public service leaders. That's absolutely not the case anymore. And the UKs of this world have much more to learn from elsewhere than I think is the case vice versa. 2 presidents. The UK is in the middle of an election at the moment, so I thought I would do something political. Of course, George Bush Sr., he didn't say, read my lips, no new legislative and policy frameworks. He said, read my lips, no new taxes. But Bill Clinton didn't say it's the behavior stupid. He said it's the economy stupid. But we're using this to illustrate something, that we're technocrats, right? I don't think any of us are politicians. Is there any politicians here? We like solutions. We like fixing things. We even though I sit here and talk about messy leadership, I like the idea of helping leaders to fix their problems. Some of these things, certainly none of the issues we're talking about, if they relate to the way people live and work, are fixable with technocratic solutions. So actually, what is the behavioral, the cultural undercurrent of what we'll be talking about today? that needs to be in place? And how do you not only build readiness to change structures, which actually is the easy bit in a lot of cases. Maybe easy is the wrong word. It's the first bit. 70% of efforts at transforming anything fail, apparently. That's what they say. Government, business, big organizations, whatever. 70% of efforts at transformation fail. Most of the experts will say they fail because we do the structural stuff and we forget about the cultural stuff. So in a way, let's try and hold that and push that back on what we talk about today. Implications? And this is the argument in a nutshell, I think. The sum total of what we've all talked about this morning, I think, is a challenge to traditional disciplines. It's a challenge to public service silos. It's a challenge to the idea of qualifying as a public servant aged 23 and having a job for life and ending it with a knighthood and a big salary and going off to retire. I think it's a challenge to that whole raft of what we consider to be the basis of work in the public service and public service delivery itself. What does that mean? How does that feel? As I've mentioned, Collaborate's view on this is often that there's no lack of good ideas and there's no lack of interesting practice, but there's a readiness gap. We don't do enough to prepare people for change. We don't do enough to, if you like, create that, build that trust. There is a fantastic turn of phrase about collaboration that it is often an uncomfortable act between unconsenting adults. It's not about having a nice conversation. It's not about consensus. It's about having the right kind of creative tension and relationships that can do better things for the public. And actually, if you don't push, if you don't struggle, then that's not going to happen. So, Sarah is now going to take us through some of that. I hope that makes some sense. Does anybody have any initial burning thoughts? Does anyone want to tell us to go away? Okay. Over to you.
Okay. Right. So a little bit about me, as I'm going to have you in all of my hands for the rest of the day, just so you know who I am, where I come from, and what my credentials are. And then I'll just give you a broad idea of what we're going to do today. I mean, you've got the agenda. We'll broadly stick to that in that we will have some lunch and we will finish at those times. But within that, then we can be more flexible if things are, there are areas you want to go into more detail, there's other stuff you want to skip through because you think it's less useful. So, okay, so I'm Sarah, and up until 6 months ago, I would say I was a public servant. I might still class myself as a public servant, but certainly I worked in the public sector. So 20 years of public sector experience. I started off in the National Audit Office, so the UK's supreme audit institution. That's the umbrella term, isn't it? Spent many years in the National Audit Office doing a range of things, but towards the end of my 10 years there, did environment, sustainable development, and sat on the InterSci working group on environmental audit, which is probably the last time I did something a bit like that, where we've got a lovely group of people and a set of microphones. And so that was that. I then went to the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit in the UK. So I spent a year under Blair and a year under Brown. So when are we there? Early 2000, 2005, 2006, 2007, around then. So that was very much... some of you might have read the book by Michael Barber that's come out recently. So yeah, I was just as Michael Barber finished towards the end of the delivery unit. So very much delivery methodology. What you do is you have a set of targets and you realign, new public management. So very interesting time to be in government, and learnt a lot from that. Don't agree with all of what we did, but certainly learnt a lot. And then having sort of audited people for 10 years and then told people how to deliver stuff for a couple of years, I felt like a bit of a hypocrite because I'd never actually delivered anything. So other than some lovely reports, which looked fabulous, and a few audit recommendations, I felt I needed to actually have some proper credentials. So I went and got a job as the chief exec of Kent Probation. So probation services, rehabilitation in the community, punishment in the community, a big part of criminal justice in the UK. we lock up a lot of people, way too many people, but twice as many people get probation as get prison. So I ran a big part of the probation service. So that was a bit of a leap. And I don't know about your countries, but certainly in our country, typically people who earn probation, adult social care, they come up through having been a probation worker or a social worker or a youth worker. They've got a professional qualification in that. I didn't. I'm an accountant. Shh, don't tell anyone. So I think, again, when we're talking about future pathways and careers, certainly what I found from my personal experience was that ability to shift from one sector to another, bring a new skill set, and how can you make that blended combination of, in my case, probation expert professionals and a set of leadership qualities really, work well and thrive. So I spent 7 or 8 years doing that, and then a year or so ago, the government was busy outsourcing probation, so putting probation to the market, which, unlike many of my public sector colleagues who thought this was, the end of the world, I was all right with, because I've always been pretty pro different sectors delivering. However, I didn't agree with the way they were doing it, and despite trying to do all sorts of interesting things with social impact bonds, decided that this was a good time to take the brave leap out of the public sector and into the social enterprise sector, and that's what Collaborate is. We're a social enterprise, so we run commercially as a business, but any surplus we make, we would reinvest back into the impact of our work. So it's that way of getting, in my view, the spirit of public service and the sort of commerciality of enterprise, but with that social entrepreneur. So that's my journey, and I hope that gives you a bit of a sense of where I'll be coming from today. What we're going to do today is we're going to run through a number of things. First of all, I want to get people's reactions to, I think, how I heard the presentations, particularly what Chin-Hung was doing, was almost setting the context. Those 5 shifts are the 5 contexts in which we then need to respond. And what Henry was doing was saying, if that's the context, what's the change in public service that we required? So I want to get how does that feel? Are those the right 5 things? Are there some that just don't resonate at all, and others that really resonate? Are there big things that you were waiting for us to say that didn't? So I really want to do that, and in the course of that discussion, give you all a bit of a chance to say who you are, where you came from, life story, inside leg measurement, anything you want to share at that point. So having done that, what I want to do is, over the course of the day, we are going to be populating these 5 brown pieces of paper, so that at the end, not only can we all take digital photos and have a record to show our friends and family, look what we've been doing. We've not just been eating lovely noodles in Singapore or whatever. We have been actually having the odd Singapore sling. No, we've been creating and working very hard. So we want to create these boards over the course of the day. So we're going to gradually build them up. Are these the right things? If they're not, we'll pull those off and put some different cards on. That's fine. And then if these are the right things, what are the characteristics? What does that really look like and feel like? And that might be different in different places, and that's great and that's good. So what does that really, if you had to describe that and make that meaningful, what would it look and feel like? Where in the world is this happening well? We might have pockets of really interesting things happening in one of these shifts. So let's start capturing that in a sort of database, in a sense, of some emerging interesting practice, and a chance to expand on some of those where in the world examples after lunch with 4 areas that are going to sort of give us some case studies into that. And then thinking about supporting the people who are going to have to deliver this change, the sort of changing nature of public services, changing nature of public servants. How do we support people who have to deliver this change? What are the enablers, both the sort of behavioural enablers and the infrastructure enablers? So thinking all the time, all through today, if we end up talking lots about behaviours, I'm going to make us talk about infrastructure. If we keep talking about infrastructure, I'm going to switch us back to behaviours, because the whole thing having to run in parallel. So that's a whistle stop tour. It's going to be really interactive. It's going to be really visual. You're not going to have to sit down the whole time. I won't make you run around too much because it is quite warm. But I hope you're up for it.